Since the beginning of time, man has lived in awe of death. The ancients shrouded its mystery in intricate and powerful ritual. What drove ancient Egyptian priests to sell mummified reptiles? How did an ancient Chinese super cop invent techniques that virtually allowed the dead to speak from the grave? Did an ancient Chinese emperor use state-of-the-art technology to guarantee himself eternal life in a heaven on earth, complete with an army, a flowing river system, and automated weaponry against future invaders? And what actually happened to the physical body of Jesus Christ during his crucifixion? The mysteries of the rituals of death are our ancient discovery. One single fact unites every human being. From the first civilization to the present day, death comes to us all.
I think there is a similarity across cultures and across time, because we're actually all terrified.
Throughout the millennia, mankind has believed that there is more to our existence.
This life has its perils and its hardships, but there is another life somewhere, which is going to be wonderful.
To achieve the transition to a chosen afterlife, we perform rituals that ease our passing into the next world. Today, most of the rituals that we perform throughout our lives have their roots in ancient history. And for billions of people all over the planet, there is no greater symbol of hope for eternal life than the crucifixion of Jesus Christ.
The story of crucifixion is a difficult one to tell, and it's also a rather discouraging subject for those who want to think of the Roman Empire as something noble, diligent, and dignified, from which we today have taken so many of our customs and morals.
Our investigations into the physiology of crucifixion reveal just how terrible this punishment is. The main purpose of crucifixion might not have been simply to execute, but to keep the victim alive in agony for as long as possible. But crucifixion is a lot older than the New Testament. It dates back to the dawn of civilization. Some scholars believe it was invented primarily as a ritual of death, designed to raise a condemned man physically above the earth during execution. The ancients believed the earth itself was a living deity that must not be contaminated by the evil touch of a wrongdoer. This was a time when early man believed nature was driven and controlled by powerful gods.
We're talking about gods that make the sun shine, make the wind blow, and all of that really is to do with survival. It's to do with harvest, it's to do with the crops, and so many ancient societies focus on the harvest.
Some of the most primeval deities were fertility gods, such as the earth goddess.
Every ancient culture had its version of the Mother Earth goddess. This would have been an incredibly important aspect in the lives of primitive people. Harvest, reproduction, plants growing, animals reproducing themselves. This would be absolutely crucial to both their cultural and their actual physical well-being.
It was vital not to offend the earth goddess.
Any kind of variance in her wonderful, bountiful gifts could have such an adverse effect on their actual lifestyle and their health.
Crucifixion satisfied a primitive religious necessity not to contaminate Holy Mother Earth with the unholy blood of the condemned man. This desire became ritualized into an execution method that survived for thousands of years.
So over a period of time, these kind of primitive beliefs would have become sort of codified and rationalized.
This gives us an insight into rituals of death. Often the underlying reason for a ritual becomes lost and forgotten until all that remains is the ritual itself. Over hundreds of years, crucifixion lost its spiritual significance and became solely an instrument of punishment and execution, primarily in the ancient East.
Crucifixion was not invented by the Romans. It in fact had been a part of a lot of ancient societies dating back perhaps to the 6th century BC into the Persian Empire.
It was discovered in Persia by Alexander the Great in the 4th century BC, and he brought it back into Europe.
Alexander the Great seems to have brought it back from the East, but it was the Romans who really employed this method big time.
Crucifixion became widespread throughout the Roman world.
One of the worst things about the Roman Empire was their punishments. Crucifixion, the summum supplicium, the worst punishment the Romans could deal out.
It was an instrument of social control.
We're talking about a very small governmental structure that somehow has to control a large population, a population that could well be lawless, that could well be criminal. The way to do that is to terrify the people into behaving.
Crucifixion was not necessarily about finding a punishment that suited the crime. Quintilian, one of the ancient sources, speaks specifically to the point of crucifixion being its exemplary effect. That means that it would deter other people from committing crimes. It was the ultimate deterrent, the same argument that is used today for the death penalty in the United States.
Crucifixion was reserved for the lowest sections of society.
If you were a Roman citizen, in most circumstances, you could not be crucified. Crucifixion was reserved for enemies, for traitors, for criminals, and for slaves. It was for the other. The call on the cross, in one particular case, when Cicero is accusing Verres, is that Verres crucified a Roman citizen, knowingly crucified a Roman citizen. And it's on that Verres is punished.
It was rare for anyone to survive more than a few hours on the cross. But in 63 AD, the historian Josephus recorded the crucifixion of 3 men.
Josephus was one of the ancient historians who chronicles the siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD.
In Josephus's account, one of the 3 victims was still alive after 3 days.
And so impressed with this were the authorities that they decided to let him down, and he survived the whole crucifixion process.
How did he survive?
Crucifixion was not necessarily an execution. It was an agonizing, obscene, and humiliating punishment.
Dr. Rob Hicks and James Dean are investigating exactly what happens to a body during a crucifixion. Perhaps this will reveal how the victim in the account by Josephus survived.
What he's going through during the crucifixion is akin to a major accident. He could be bleeding to death, his kidneys will be packing up, his heart could stop, he could have a cardiac arrest. He will certainly be becoming unconscious at some stage, whether that's because of dehydration or because of simply not being able to get the oxygen into his lungs.
The images of outstretched arms and nails in the hands and feet is familiar to people all over the world. But now, for the first time, James and Rob are using 3D graphics to explore the internal trauma of a crucifixion victim. They have discovered that the body weight pushing down on the lungs makes it increasingly difficult to raise the ribs to inhale.
We see his diaphragm move down. We see the intercostal muscles here by the ribs struggling. We get the recession there, showing just how hard he's working to breathe properly. And in time, that's going to become so difficult that he will give up. He'll become unconscious and he'll die.
James and Rob have discovered a primary cause of death during execution: suffocation. With the arms raised, the victim cannot raise his ribs properly to inhale. This painful, prolonged torture can last for hours, even days, depending on the fitness of the victim.
He cannot inhale or exhale sufficiently to stay alive. He will struggle against that because it's instinctive to try and stay alive, but eventually he will lose.
Our simulation has revealed how the victim in Josephus's account may have survived the ordeal.
If somebody has basically given up hope, they're more likely to give in and die. If you've got a positive outlook saying, look, I'm going to beat this, then there's a better chance of survival.
And it depends on the strength of the man and the condition he's in as to how long that lasts.
The faint possibility of surviving crucifixion does not diminish its horror.
In the Roman world, keeping control of your own body was the ultimate human right. And so to crucify someone, to take their body and to nail it or hold it to a cross with ropes and to allow them to die slowly, agonizingly over days was the ultimate deterrent and the ultimate punishment. It dishonored the individual more than any other punishment possibly could.
A primeval pagan ritual of death designed to not offend nature gods was reinvented by the Romans as a torture method. But with the suffering of Christ, the cross was reborn to become an element of a new ritual of death for Christians, right to the present day. But what people believe comes after death is different across the ages and from culture to culture. In ancient Egypt, animals were thought to be messengers between this world and the next. Now, ancient discoveries will investigate the mystery of crocodile mummies. Ancient Egypt was a civilization obsessed with the rituals of death. Some of the most amazing achievements ever created were built by the Egyptians, and nearly all of them were concerned with death and the afterlife. The pyramids, the great tombs, temples, and mummies. But it was not only people who were mummified. The ancient Egyptians also mummified animals. To discover why, Egyptologist and mummy expert Salima Ikram has traveled to the temple of Kom Ombo on the bank of the great river Nile.
There probably was always a temple at Kom Ombo, because generally sites where you see a temple, the temple is built there because that site has been sacred for hundreds and hundreds of years.
The temple was dedicated to the crocodile god Sobek.
The ancient Egyptians chose a lot of their gods based on the natural world, and crocodiles are large, terrifying things, so they wanted to appease them. Also, of course, anything that comes from the Nile or from water has a very sacred nature for the ancient Egyptians, because one of their creation myths talk about how the world emerged from water.
Sobek became among Egypt's most important deities.
He really came into his own about 2000 BC, when a lot of lakes were being used and there were crocodiles there, and so any god associated with water and with power of fertility and virility, like Sobek, all became sort of very important, and that's when Sobek first started having major temples dedicated to himself.
Crocodiles were allowed to roam freely around the temple in honor of the god.
Not only did they have the traditional images of the god kept in a sacred place, but they also had live crocodiles here who were the personification of the god Sobek. And so people would come from miles and miles around to go and visit the god, to make offerings to the god, and also sort of to be in the presence of the deity himself.
The crocodile was revered even after death. Here in a side room are the desiccated remains of an animal that once wandered in the temple. This priceless relic was once venerated by countless pilgrims.
This crocodile has probably been dead for at least 2,000 years, and maybe a bit more.
Worshippers would also make offerings of mummified crocodiles to the gods.
By giving a votive offering of a crocodile, what the worshipper does is offer something that is much more intimate to the god, and also this little mummified crocodile acted as a sort of ambassador for the person for all of eternity. So you always had someone whispering to Sobek.
The first stage of mummification is to immerse the body in natural salts to draw out the moisture. Without moisture, it cannot rot. When it is completely dry, it is coated in a preservative resin to bind the surface against deterioration. Preserving a reptile was relatively easy compared with catching one.
Acquiring crocodiles must have taken some skill, because crocodiles are enormous, very fierce creatures, and you wouldn't want to be on the head end of them unless you really knew what you were doing. So I think acquiring the crocodiles was a great act of adventure and of faith.
But even obtaining a little one posed a problem. There weren't enough to go around.
One of the problems, of course, with having so many pilgrims wanting to give votive mummies as offerings is that sometimes the demand exceeded the supply.
The priests of Kom Ombo Temple were forced to improvise.
Some of the crocodile bundles do not contain what they're supposed to contain. They might contain a fragment of it, or else they might contain a piece of wood or a stone, or even a fragment of a human body part, but wrapped up to look as if it actually is whatever creature is supposed to be being offered.
No one would know what was really inside.
on the whole, the better wrapped and the more beautiful the exterior of a mummy,